and he can set you up for that. And we have, okay, so I'll go ahead and start now. So welcome everybody to Environmental Engineering Graduate Seminar. The good news is we have all our slots filled for the semester. We even had one extra, so I scheduled an extra talk that you got an invitation to. It's on Wednesday at 3 o'clock. Maybe not this Wednesday, but check your invitations. So that's added benefit. So while we're waiting for Kenny's advisor to log in,
we don't actually have to wait for him.
Oh, well, I'll just ask briefly for anyone from the audience, do you have any announcements or anything you want to say before we start? Okay, not hearing any. I'll go ahead and introduce you. So today we're honored to have Kenny join us. Kenny is currently doing a Ph.D. in environmental engineering here at Michigan Tech. He has a BS in geology from Utah Valley University and a BA in French studies. Maybe the first one we've had has a degree in French. Hopefully today's talk is in English though for our benefit. Kenny serves as the CEE department rep to the graduate student government and is currently on the GSG Sustainability Committee. He served as an official observer for Michigan Tech at the 2019 COP25 in Madrid, Spain. He was also awarded the Graduate Student Service Award in spring 2020, as well as the David W. Hand Environmental Process Engineering Lab Award in spring 2019. And today he's going to talk to us about Give a Damn, dynamic variations of beaver ponds, their impact on the phosphorus cycle, and why we should care. So with that, go ahead, Kenny.
All right, well, thanks everybody for joining us today. So today we're going to learn why we should give a damn. So let's start off with a little bit of background. But before we do that, I would like to give a special thanks to the Keweenaw Bay Indian community and Gratiot Lake Conservancy, who have allowed me to conduct research on their lands. So I'm going to start off with a question here. So, and I'm going to poll all of you. So how many beavers were estimated to live in North America prior to European contact? So everybody go ahead and respond. We're going to put you to the test here. All right, couple more seconds. All right, so it looks like, can everybody see the results? If not, I'll tell you. So it looks like the majority of people got it right. So if you chose between 60 million and 400 million. So beavers were once ubiquitous across North American streams. They essentially had colonized all low order streams across North America. Estimated populations pre-European contact were between 60 million and 400 million individuals. However, overhunting and an extirpation of beaver resulted in a population low of about 100,000 individuals that occurred somewhere in the early 1900s. So I guess moving on to the next question here is, how many beavers do you think currently live in North America? All right. Okay, so the majority said 1 million. So the good news is we have slightly more than 1 million. There are currently estimated between 8 and 15 million beavers living in North America. So as you can see, there was a pretty big drop in their population. And it kind of begs the question, what did we actually lose when we lost all these beavers from our streams? So aside from just losing the population of beavers, we lost ecosystems because beavers are ecosystem engineers and keystone species. And when I say ecosystem engineer, I'm in general just referring to an animal that significantly alters or maintains its surrounding ecosystem for its own benefit. And then we expound that to beaver being a keystone species, which is an animal which holds a critical role in the functioning of a larger ecosystem. So when we lost over 90% of the population of beavers, we lost a lot of their impacts. So here is just a quick rundown from a comprehensive literature review showing some of these impacts that beavers had on our headwater streams. And so this is showing the upstream to downstream effects. So that the x-axis here is effect ratios. So a positive value means that the numbers are higher downstream, and a negative one downstream of a beaver pond, and negative values mean that the numbers are higher upstream of a pond. So we can see here that it has positive benefits for fish habitat and fish populations, macroinvertebrates, ecosystem functioning, which is essentially primary productivity, dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen decreases downstream of beaver ponds, and temperature increases, as well as we see that there are significant changes in the hydrologic velocity, so just water velocity, and a big increase in water area. So essentially what this is showing is that beavers have a large impact on their environment. And it's multifaceted impacts. So some of the specific changes that are going to be important are beavers increase water retention, they mitigate flooding, and they reconnect streams, or they reconnect streams to their floodplains, or they create floodplains, they increase groundwater interaction and recharge, they decrease the velocity, reduce suspended sediment, and they create a patchy network in the stream, so it increases the stream complexity. Then some of the biologic changes that we see are that they open forest canopy, they increase species diversity, they make a shift towards more water tolerant plants in emergent macrophytes and even submergent macrophytes. They increase zooplankton and phytoplankton. And one of the most important are that they increase respiration. And it's estimated that they can increase respiration 13 to 35 fold. And that's looking at on a meter squared per hour. So if you normalize that to a residence time, like in the nutrient spiraling, that increase in respiration goes up even further to somewhere about 400 to 2,000 times higher, because when it's combined with that increase.
My daughter Ingrid Seagren is a patient of Dr. Coney.
Hold on one
Hey,
second.
Eric, can you mute? Can you mute Eric?
Yeah. All right.
Angela, you can mute him. Yeah.
So, so we can see that this increases in respiration are significant. They're orders of magnitude higher in these beaver ponds than they are in the traditional stream that we see here, where you just have one fixed channel with a somewhat limited floodplain. And an interesting thing, if you look at this image right here, this shows the change of the Catawagoma Peninsula, and it's the change in forest cover over a 40 or 50 year period after the reintroduction of beavers. So you can see up here in 1940, the type of the type of coverage was essentially non-impounded land, very little open water. And then if you go to 1986, you can see that there was a significant change in the total area of the landscape that is impacted seasonally and long-term by beaver ponds. And then getting a little bit more specific to what I'm going to be looking into phosphorus, there are some important physiochemical changes that take place in beaver ponds. So the first being that there's a shift towards an anaerobic environment, which just means that there's going to be low oxygen, and the respiration is going to be, the outputs are going to be different than in an aerobic environment. Beaver ponds also create large pools of nutrients in the pond sediment. So as you can see here, that this is just a rough representation of a typical beaver pond, where there's a lot of anaerobic soil. So there's a lot of anaerobic digestion going on within these systems, and they hold a lot of organic matter. And so as beaver ponds transform matter, this is most likely going to be the main source of where the nutrients are coming from. And then they also increase the temperature of the system, which has a lot of effects for the rate of reactions, stratification within ponds, as well as things like salmonid species. Fish prefer different temperatures of water. And so now we're going to look a little bit at some of the immediate effects on aquatic nutrients, so carbon. So when carbon enters a beaver pond, it enters an anaerobic environment when it hits the sediment. So methane is produced in beaver ponds, and there's also a general movement from particulate to dissolved state matter. So what comes in as a tree that gets cut down and put into a dam, what you will see is that as that decomposes, it moves from particulate organic matter to dissolved organic matter. One of the other effects we see is that there's a net increase in carbon available in the system. So there's an increase in total carbon as well, which makes sense because beavers are actively putting their forage and trees in there that they're cutting. And then for nitrogen, it gets a little bit more interesting. So there's somewhat of a disconnect in the literature. So a lot of, in the literature, so Naiman et al. In 1988, it's kind of a seminal work on beaver ponds, said that beaver ponds increase nitrogen levels compared to streams through sediment fixation of nitrogen. However, more recent studies have shown that beaver ponds actually reduce nitrogen levels in high nitrogen environments through denitrification. But both of those studies showed that there is a relative increase in the levels of ammonium that are from the pond, from upstream to downstream as it passes through a beaver pond. And then this is going to be the focus for the rest of today, phosphorus. So in general, beaver ponds are considered a net sink for phosphorus. But that is, again, there's some discrepancy in the literature that's at odds with that initial chart that I showed you, showed that beaver ponds were net sink or net sources for phosphorus. Also, there's that same movement of phosphorus to the dissolved state. So from total phosphorus to total dissolved phosphorus and soluble reactive phosphorus. And then within the ponds, they change the stream system to a reducing environment with lower values of dissolved oxygen. At least that's what the literature has said up to this point. But there are some key gaps in knowledge that still need to be addressed in the phosphorus cycling that happens in beaver ponds. The first being that we don't understand the short-term variations in SRP, so we don't know what happens on the daily and hourly scales within ponds. We know that there are important seasonal variations, but we don't understand the short-term ones. We also need to resolve the conflicts resulting from the different studies showing that beaver ponds can act as both a sink and a source of phosphorus to a system. And we also need to address the assumption that everyone's working with that beaver ponds can be treated as a well-mixed water body or reactor. And then finally, continuing along that thought process, we need to determine if the role of internal loading of phosphorus plays a role in beaver ponds, because that has not been addressed. And because beaver ponds are somewhat like small lakes, they are a lot smaller, but they could also have experience internal loading of phosphorus with the large loads of nutrient that get stored in the sediment. So when I say internal cycling of phosphorus, what that means is that there's phosphorus that accumulates in the anoxic layers of a lake or a pond. And then when that pond mixes, that phosphorus, the phosphorus that's held onto the sediment, which is generally soluble reactive phosphorus, will be released into the surface waters as it mixes. And so if that is playing a role in beaver ponds, then that has an impact on what nutrients are passed downstream and when they are passed downstream. So some of the things that are going to be affecting the phosphorus levels in beaver ponds are the form of phosphorus, the different ways that it's precipitating out, whether it's precipitating or whether it's sorbing to sediment surfaces. And a lot of those are impacted by some of those physiochemical things that we talked about earlier, so like pH or dissolved oxygen, reducing environments, and so on. So in 2019, I started doing my research up by Gratiot Lake, which is about an hour north of here, on a series of beaver ponds. And here's a map of it. And my general starting hypothesis was that SRP is going to increase downstream of dams, which was something that was generally supported by the literature, but we just wanted to verify it. And then the other one was looking at if we can consider dams generally well-mixed reactors. So my hypothesis going in was that we can consider them as well-mixed reactors. And so the initial results came back. So if you're looking here, the sample locations are on the x-axis. Sites 2 and 5 are channelized sections, and all the other ones, 2, 5, 6, or 2, 3, or 1, 3, 4, 6, and 7 are ponds. And so what we do see is that downstream of ponds, we are seeing increases in SRP. So with location 2 here, which I'll go back to the map, it's kind of hard to see, but this is location 2. We saw consistent, much higher levels of SRP, which was downstream of this dam here. And it was not quite to the same extent with location 5, which is right there, but we were seeing SRP increases downstream. Now, when things after a seasonal change, so in October, we can see here, it's this maroon color, things change significantly, but also the processes within the pond also significantly changed. So we're going to generally be looking at what's going on during the summer months here. And so to kind of control for whether the SRP changes were due to just general increases in total phosphorus and the ratios were staying the same, or if it was just internal cycling between SRP and TDP, I looked at the ratios, and so what we saw was that generally the ratios of SRP to TP stayed the same, but there was a lot of internal fluctuation between total dissolved phosphorus and total phosphorus. So the dissolved state was varying a lot, but SRP seemed to be predicted or related to total phosphorus in the system. But one of the things that we did see that I wasn't necessarily expecting were these significant dye-yield changes in dissolved oxygen. So there was a dissolved sensor that was sitting in a dissolved oxygen sensor sitting in the surface of the pond. And we can see here, this is just a cut from about 1 month worth of data, that we're experiencing some very large fluctuations in dissolved oxygen levels. So these we're taking readings every hour, but we're seeing that in the ponds there are certain days where it gets up to 12 milligrams per liter in dissolved oxygen, and then it'll drop back down to near zero. So we're seeing these incredible swings in dissolved oxygen, which can have a large impact on the solubility of phosphorus within a system and what's being conveyed downstream of a pond. And these changes were correlated with temperature and sunlight, and they're most likely being driven by primary productivity within the ponds and photosynthesis. So as a result of that first year, what we saw was that ponds do experience significant changes in temperature and dissolved oxygen, and that channelized sections downstream do have a higher SRP to TP ratio than ponds do during summer months. So, but this kind of led me to a realization that might have kind of been a methodological error on my part, is that all of my samples generally occurred before 2 p.m. And so if we go back and we look at these a little closer, these large spikes in dissolved oxygen started picking up between 12 and 2 p.m. in the afternoon. So what we're actually seeing is that there were important changes in dissolved oxygen that were taking place after most of my samples had been taken, because nobody likes to take samples at 5 p.m. at night and process them in a lab at 10 p.m. So what that meant is that we need to be looking at a more complete scale of what phosphorus is doing within these ponds, because it is experiencing these important shifts during the day. So that led me to my research this year, which is on Kelsey Creek, which is just north of Baraga. And so my three objectives this year were to determine if there is evidence of dissolved oxygen changes affecting SRP levels in the pond. So not just realizing that there are changing dissolved oxygen levels, but trying to correlate those with changes in SRP. And then also I wanted to determine if stratification is occurring within the ponds, because we were also seeing these major shifts in temperature during the day. And so I thought it was possible that stratification was occurring, even though it is a very shallow lake or a shallow pond, that during parts of the day, stratification impeding mixing was occurring. And then I also wanted to determine if SRP changes are being passed downstream of dams on those hourly timescales. So this is a picture, an aerial picture of the site right here. And then this is just an overhead map. And then this is going to be the pond that we sampled intensely for SRP, as well as all of the water quality parameters. So you can see the pond that's just right there on the right, an aerial photograph, and then the map on the left. So this year we equipped out as many ponds as we could. So I put out 5 beaver buoys, which I placed in the 5 connecting ponds down. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what these were, essentially, they were temperature sensors that were placed every 1/4 meter, and dissolved oxygen sensors placed every 1/2 meter on these little buoys that were placed in the ponds. I also put level logging stations in 4 of the dams to measure relative changes in the surface of the ponds, as well as there were light sensors to get an idea of how much light was impacting how much light was reaching the pond surfaces. We used 3 sondes, one that was placed upstream of the dam, in the dam, and then right downstream of the dam, to look at some of these changes and how quickly they are changing. We also obtained a seabird cyclophosphate sensor, which is an in situ nutrient analyzer that measures SRP. So it's essentially a wet lab that we can place in the pond that we deployed over the year. So our first result I thought was pretty significant. So, but going into this, let me restate some of my hypotheses real fast. So beaver ponds experience stratification on a daily basis, and the stratification affects phosphorus levels within the pond. So my expected result to this, especially to the second hypothesis, was I was expecting to see stratification occurring during the day and SRP levels increasing at night after mixing with when the surface water would again mix with the sediment and pore water. But what we found was that yes, beaver ponds are experiencing stratification on a daily basis, and that they are correlated with SRP levels or phosphate levels, but they are the inverse of what we were expecting. So what we're seeing is that, so this is a temperature net of pond of one of the ponds we were looking at, of pond 4. And so you can see that this is the depth, and then these are just the dates. So this is a close-up of a 10-day period. So we can see that almost every day there were important increases in temperature in the top about ½ meter of the water column. So this white line right here is the thermocline as defined by Lake Analyzer. And so I overlaid that on this temperature net, and what we're seeing is that there is stratification occurring generally from about noon to 10 p.m. and then it breaks down. And so if you look at the graph on the right here, we see that again, but a little closer up. The line in black right here those are SRP levels. So it's in micrograms. So this scale is off. That should be 20, not 0.02, but it's micrograms per liter. So what we're seeing is that during this stratified event, so in the surface water, we are seeing high levels of SRP. And so what's interesting here is that we see it growing throughout this week. And then if we look on August 2nd right here, there was a rain event. And so it rained, and then we essentially lose any signal of an increase in SRP. And we also lost any stratification within the water column for that day. So it's pretty strong evidence that there is a correlation between those two events. At this point, I don't know what is causing those. That's going to be something interesting, and to keep everybody on the edge of their seat and to come back in 2 years when I present my final results. But there definitely is a correlation. And so revisiting this idea of internal loading, where SRP is correlated with these changes in dissolved oxygen, we would expect to see these SRP spikes at night. But what we saw was completely opposite. We were seeing these spikes actually occurring when dissolved oxygen was at its highest, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's not any internal loading, but this may not be but oxygen is not necessarily the mechanism driving it. Along with the changes in temperature, we also see the same stratification and the same stratification occurring with dissolved oxygen, however. So this graph on the left is a graph of the dissolved oxygen levels throughout the entire summer. So what we can see is that there are significant changes even over the summer, not just on a daily basis, but even over the summer. And this is probably a lot of this is probably driven by increases in temperature and changing pond levels. But we see that the same correlation exists where we're seeing extremely high levels of dissolved oxygen in the surface that generally taper down to the sediment. But on a lot of these days, we are seeing that there's stratification within this system, where we're getting zero levels of dissolved oxygen that are sharply delineated with these increases to about 4 or 5 around the ½ meter mark, like we were seeing with the temperature. And then another thing that was interesting that we noticed was the relationship of ORP, dissolved oxygen, and pH. So we were expecting to see changes in pH and dissolved oxygen associated with photosynthesis, but I was not necessarily expecting to see ORP drop as dissolved oxygen levels increased within the pond. So the takeaway with this is kind of that there are other things at play here than just dissolved oxygen that are controlling phosphorus being conveyed downstream. So other reduction pairs could be at play within this, such as nitrogen or iron. And so that's definitely something we need to continue looking at. But I also thought it was just interesting the magnitude that we were seeing some of these pH changes as well. So we were seeing pH changes and sometimes up to 1 or 1.5 units. So it would generally sit around 6, but sometimes we would see it, or it would sit around 6.5, but sometimes we would see it go up and reach about a pH of about 8. And then just another variable to kind of think about in all of this is the changing pond levels within the pond. So this is an overlay of a temperature net throughout the summer combined with the relative level of the pond. So we can see that significant rain events will actually change the entire makeup of the pond, at least from a thermal point of view. So we can see that there was a big rain event right here towards the end of August, and that the system never warmed back up again to the same extent before that. So that cold streak that we had in late August more or less changed some of the functioning processes within the system. So the big takeaway from this year was that beaver ponds can experience multi-day stratification events and frequently experience daily stratification events. And those are correlated with SRP in the surface water of ponds. The other one was that ponds experience large changes in dissolved oxygen, which is also correlated with changes in ORP and pH. But both of those have an opposite impact of what we would have expected. So that kind of moves us into the so what. So I've asked a lot of questions and I still haven't found any answers yet. And so those will be forthcoming, but you might have to wait till the next seminar for a lot of those. But the impact that all this can have kind of goes back to our understanding of how these low order streams actually function. So there's a quote from Peter Kahn that says there's a shifting baseline of what we consider the environment. And as that baseline becomes impoverished, we don't see it. And this really applies to beavers because even after doing all of this research, I can probably say I've seen a beaver 5 times in my life, and I've spent 2 years trudging through beaver ponds. So there's this concept that our scientific understanding of how these low order streams should work are based on research that was conducted when beavers were essentially not present on the landscape. And so the answers to these questions and these hypotheses of what's going on at this fundamental level in beaver ponds can also fundamentally change our understanding of low order streams. Then there's another saying, it comes from a French saying, but about birds. It probably exists in English, but I adapted it to beavers. So it's stick by stick, the beaver builds its dam. And what that means is that a single beaver doesn't necessarily impact an entire system or change an entire system. But because of how ubiquitous they were, how common they were, and just their sheer numbers, they have the potential to impact nearly every headwater stream and low order stream in North America. And there's also a lot of evidence that beaver ponds are not ephemeral. They don't leave an ephemeral impact on the landscape, but they have a lasting impact. So going back to the very beginning, they're about pre-European contact, we estimate 60 to 400 million individuals. But how does this relate to dams? Because it's not the beaver population that changes these landscapes, but it's their dams. So most of the estimates of how many dams were in North America are generally poorly constrained and based off of population and colony density estimations, which pretty early on were identified as poor ways to estimate total dam construction. So some of the numbers that are out there are at least 25 million, or 15 to 100 million, or 24 to 400 million. So these dam estimates are kind of all over the place. But some new approaches in the literature that are being taken are focusing on that dams should be based on a physical environment approach and not necessarily on population indicators. And this is because beavers will colonize anything that they can in the long run. And taken from the fact that beavers were present in North America for at least 7 million years, they had ample time to colonize the entirety of North America where they potentially could colonize North America. So I did some calculations just based off of literature values, looking at the total dam density, the total potential sediment retained behind dams, as well as the total loads of phosphorus, and then taking an average value for age of beaver ponds based off of sedimentation rates and pond depths, how much phosphorus could be stored per year across the continent of North America. And I used a stochastic Monte Carlo-esque approach to this. And so what we're seeing is that in all of the trials I ran, the total dams, the average of all the trials, and I ran 10,000 trials for each one of these. So the total dams, they're in the United States alone. This doesn't include Canada because I didn't incorporate their stream data into it. But there could be up to 49.3 million dams in the United States, which is a significant amount if we think about how many dams there currently are, and then we think about just how many dams 49 million dams actually is. And then when we put that in terms of sediment, so I took sediment retained behind beaver dams from literature values, and I applied a curve to that. I fit a curve to it. And then I extrapolated the total dams to the total sediment. And there could be up to, and it's good to note that these are probably all maximum levels, because I didn't constrain the physical environment by a whole lot. So it's essentially based on first to fourth order streams. But there are some other things that would limit that as well. But so there's a maximum potential of about 18.7 cubic kilometers of sediment to be held behind all of these ponds. And about 9.3 metric tons of phosphorus can be held by these ponds at any time. And while I understand that these are very broad estimates, I think they kind of show a potential max, and what these numbers are really showing is that beaver ponds could have an impact on phosphorus cycling in North America if they were to retake their ecological role. And then breaking that down to how many metric tons per year based on beaver pond turnover time as beaver pond sediment in, it was something like 421,000 metric tons per year, which is about as much phosphorus as drains out of the Mississippi River every year. So some of the long-term impacts, not just the scale, are beaver ponds generally have a pretty consistent succession that they go through. So there's a new pond, the pond floods the surrounding area, then the pond will sediment in, and then either the dam will break, releasing sediment downstream, or it moves to some more long-term irreversible successions, such as it becomes an emergent wetland, it turns into a forested wetland, or it becomes part of a mature forest system. And so what we're seeing is that while beaver ponds themselves may only last between a couple years to 100 years, they have the potential to impact the landscape for centuries. And there was a really interesting study that came out in 2015 from Ishpeming, where there was an 1868 map that noted 64 locations of beaver ponds around the railroad down there. And in 2015, somebody went and identified all of those beaver ponds again. And what they were able to find is that 72% of the beaver ponds that were mapped in 1868 are still discernible in 2014. which means that over a period of 150 years, there's still a legacy of beavers on the landscape, which means that we may only be feeling some of the effects of the loss of beavers right now because we hit the population low about 200 years ago. And so it's interesting to look that of the 64 ponds that were mapped, 25% of them are still active beaver ponds. But then we see a lot of other things that have gone on where some of them are beaver meadows, some of them are shrubs or shrub wetlands. Some of them have been channelized, some have been buried, and some have been impacted by human, like anthropogenic. They've been impacted by us. But that's just showing how long-term these processes can be as well. So in conclusion, beaver ponds do have a major impact on their local environments, and that ponds are incredibly dynamic, but they also follow consistent patterns, which gives hope for being able to create a good model to help managers manage phosphorus within ponds. But even going further than that, beaver ponds have shaped low order streams in North America, and their resurgent populations could do that again. But understanding how these ponds actually affect stream dynamics is going to be very important as we see, because it is going to change what our understanding of a fundamental working of a low order stream is. And so with that, I will end my presentation, and I will answer I don't know to any of your questions.
All right, thanks, Kenny. This is a thunderous round of applause for you. I'm sure everybody's very appreciative. I see some hands clapping there. That's good. So any questions from anybody or comments for Kenny?
So Kenny, I have a question. This is John Gerke. Are you also monitoring solar radiance and more importantly, wind speed, wind direction at your sites? It seems to me this stratification could be affected significantly by sheer wind stress on the since beaver ponds tend to be mostly shallow.
Yeah, so unfortunately this year we didn't have an on-site weather station. We would love to get a weather station out there next year, and we were looking into it to different options. But so this year we are using a weather station which was located a couple miles away, and there does show to be, in some of the data, there does show to be increased wind activity on the days where stratification is weaker, but it's not necessarily predictive of stratification occurring. But there definitely is a signal with wind going on there. And it's something that one of our next steps is modeling metabolism for the stratified period within beaver ponds as if they were a lake. And that will be one of the inputs. So, so short term, we are thinking about it, but we weren't able to get site specific data for this year.
Any other questions for Kenny? I have a question, and that is, what do we want to see for phosphorus or even nitrogen? I know that comes from some fertilizers that humans put on intentionally onto watersheds that might come into these beaver ponds. Beaver ponds also affect those levels. Yeah. What would we like to see? What would nature like to see for a healthy ecosystem, do you think?
I think part of my argument is we don't necessarily know because we don't know what the baseline is, but there's this term culturally eutrophied, which means that lakes because increased phosphorus can lead to eutrophication of lakes. And so extremely high levels of phosphorus can impact water quality which affects our drinking water sources or even our recreation. And the term culturally eutrophied means we want phosphorus levels to be at a level where we're still able to use surface waters for their original purposes. So it can somewhat vary system by system, but across the board, I would generally say we need to see a reduction in both nitrogen and phosphorus in surface waters. But there are definitely going to be a lot of room for variation within that comment.
So do you see a thick layer of algae forming on top that would cause that eutrophication? And
in beaver ponds, you generally do not see that thick layer of algae, and part of that is probably due to the increased levels of zooplankton and minnows and grazing fish within these systems. But you do see a lot of very loose sediment, almost flocculent, on the bottom of these ponds, which is another variable to think about too. But you generally don't see the pond scum layers floating on the surface of beaver ponds.
thank you. Any other questions for Kenny? Any students have a question or comment?
I'm gonna also bring up, since I used to catch beavers a long time ago as a grad student, is that your quote on stick by stick, the modification of the French, you've overlooked the fact that the dam retaining capability of beaver dams is actually the mud. The sticks hold the mud.
Yeah.
And,
And there was
but
actually
that mud part also gets me wondering about this sediment transport consideration for a series of beaver dams. You know, you think of the upstream most one collecting the first shot of phosphorus from a watershed. You know, that transport through the series is pretty complicated, and more than just the chemistry and more than just the wind and the temperature. And so that your study needs to have a really complicated and methodical way of elucidating all those transport and transformation processes.
And a lot of it even comes down to how water passes through the dams, whether it's more of a percolation through there or whether piping develops and is it draining from the top of the pond, bottom of the pond. It can get very complicated. But lucky for me, I've still got a couple years left to try and figure it out. So.
Any other questions for Kenny?
If anybody ever has any other questions, I'm always up for talking about my research, as is every other graduate student. So feel free to send me an email or say hi to me.
Do you have a sense, Kenny, what size rivers beaver ponds are on? Are they on larger rivers or just smaller streams?
So generally damming only occurs on smaller than fourth order streams, and can be a lot of variability in that as well. There's a new model that's being built out of Utah State that looks at stream power as an indicator. But I don't know the exact numbers on quantifying that, but generally they won't dam anything larger than a fourth order, and even a lot of fourth order dams they won't, or fourth order streams they won't dam just because of flooding events that occur on them.
I don't want to start a fight between you and Dr. Gerke, but are these beaver dams good or bad? Beavers are a pest, right? We should get rid of all of them, right? Because they're damming up my property, causing flooding on my road and Dash Garnet. I don't like these beavers.
Well, I can take a pretty solid stance that I am very pro beaver, but it's also the understanding that because they are ecosystem engineers and we are ecosystem engineers, there is a lot for potential conflict. The bottom line essentially comes that our ecosystems evolved with beavers being an active part of that ecosystem and managing nutrients in our streams. And so we should be doing our best to kind of return to the natural functioning of those, but we also do have to realize that we have to adapt our systems, and that in every situation, there's not always going to be a compatible compromise.
So how do humans live together in harmony with nature? Huh?
Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that question.
Yeah, tough question. Any last questions or comments for Kenny?
I have a question.
Mhm.
Thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. I'm just wondering if, and you might have mentioned this, have you looked a lot at water chemistry in terms of groundwater input and surface water input, or are these all surface water dominated?
That is a good question. We haven't necessarily looked at groundwater inputs. We've mainly been focusing on surface water. An assumption that I'm working with, which most of my assumptions that I've worked with beaver ponds have been incorrect up to this point, so we'll see where it goes, is that while there is an increase in groundwater interaction, my assumption is that most of it is going to be exiting the ponds as opposed to going into the ponds. But that's something that I have been thinking about and should probably be addressed in the future as well, because I think that there is a potential impact on that.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Anybody else? All right, well, thanks everybody for coming today. Appreciate it. And we will see you next week. And any other questions, you can email Kenny. Thanks, everybody.